there and welcome back to another Disney video. And recently, I talked about my fears for the future of Disney and Pixar animation, discussing how it seems like we're entering a new era for animation once again for Disney. And in that video, I concluded that the Disney Revival era, which I think lasts from Bolt to Ralph Breaks the Internet, was probably Disney's most financially and critically successful era of all time. And that got me thinking, is it though? Is that actually true? After all, Disney has a long and storied history. Would it make sense to consider this most recent decade its finest? And of course, the decade that kept coming back to me was the Renaissance of the 90s, which saw Disney explode in popularity, and in concert with the rise of a number of other animation studios, saw the medium become one of the world's most popular, and a financial powerhouse in the world of film. And so, that's kind of what I want to do today. Walk through both the Disney Renaissance era and the Disney Revival era, and decide which is superior, both in the quality of the product, reception and acclaim, and in its box office success. It's a pretty tall order, and many might instantly jump on the Renaissance era as the ultimate. After all, there's some pretty extreme nostalgia factor that goes on whenever the Renaissance comes up. A nostalgia that I don't think people are quite ready to attach to the Revival era for the most part. But yeah, before the comparison starts, we should go through each era. So, the Renaissance era of Disney animation kicked off in 1989 with the release of The Little Mermaid. Prior to this film, I'd argue that animation was a bit of a sideshow, a fun gimmick to entertain, but wasn't really held to the same level as live-action cinema, especially once the quality began to dip with the death of Walt Disney in the 60s. But The Little Mermaid came out and suddenly, these films were viable, not just critically, but financially. And suddenly every man and his dog was out there starting up an animation company and trying to replicate that success. Disney then followed this up with Rescuers Down Under, which was well received but made no money. And then Beauty and the Beast, which was a complete and utter triumph, a smash hit, even nominated for Best Picture at the Oscars. Aladdin and The Lion King then followed that, topping the worldwide box office for both their years of release, and becoming the highest grossing animated films ever. And honestly, this is where the Renaissance peaked. But it wasn't over yet. Pocahontas would follow, and then Hunchback and Hercules. And whilst they didn't hit the highs of the early 90s, they were still prominent. Mulan was next, and that's probably the biggest film of the late 90s for the Renaissance era. And then Tarzan wrapped things up in 1999. A massively iconic filmography right there. Hit after hit after hit. And that's probably the defining feature of the Renaissance. The films were fire, but they also had a lot of common elements. They were often fairy tale in nature, a return to the past, to their roots, and saw grand epic tales, musical numbers, exciting colour, princesses, romance, whimsy, an era that really encapsulated the magic of old school golden age Disney. But in turn, it managed to give it a new coat of paint. That's how I describe this era. And then we have the Revival era, which I can also argue could just be called the Lasseter era. The era where he joined the team after Pixar was acquired by Disney and was thrust into a position of great creative control. The man's a sex pest, let's acknowledge, and I am glad he got the boot. But the man knew how to produce a great animated film. And quite quickly after he joined the team, Disney's fortunes picked up. After some growing pains with Meet the Robinsons, which was well received but a bomb, we saw Disney start to explode, and thus the revival began, starting with Bolt in 2008. We moved on to The Princess and the Frog, then Tangled. Winnie the Pooh was a tiny dip, but Wreck-It Ralph did well. Frozen well and truly changed the game in terms of princess films. Big Hero 6, Zootopia, Moana, all smash hits. And then we finish with Ralph Breaks the Internet and Lasseter departs from the studio. And after this, I do think Disney's storytelling has started to shift quite a lot as new voices have gotten their chance to shine. And yeah, like the Renaissance, the Revival had an emphasis on grand storytelling, but it modernized everything. They took the classical musical style and gave it a new coat of paint. They took the old Disney animal film and modernized it. And they took a lot more inspiration from, well, Pixar, honestly, and started to make a number of films that fit that sort of style as well. In reality, the Revival was all about Disney throwing out a hugely broad range of films and achieving tremendous success both critically and at the box office. And so, now we come down to it, which era is best? Which was the most lucrative, the most iconic, the most acclaimed? There's so many comparisons to make, so I guess you gotta start with legacy. And I think for now, the Renaissance sweeps this category, hands down. Because what's the legacy of the Revival era? Little girls dressing up as Anna and Elsa? Baymax toys? Lots of money in Disney's pocket? Yeah, there's that. But the Renaissance did so much more, because it catapulted animation into the limelight. And so whilst some industry creatives, and indeed members of the public, they still scoff and see animation as lesser, to the decision makers, the ones who actually care about the film industry as a business, the ones that want their companies to make money and succeed, It's gotten big. Animation is money. The Little Mermaid made people take notice. Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, Lion King, box office smashes, more lucrative than any animation that came before. And so suddenly, an industry that had sporadic films and very few studios making animation for cinema was inundated with different animation branches of all the major studios. And of course, the ones that have really stood the test of time from the 90s, besides Disney, are DreamWorks and Pixar for the most part. And yeah, they're pretty huge. Oscar winners, commercial acclaim. They've made franchises that are key parts of people's childhoods, classics of the screen. And then there's more recent studios like Illumination, which seems to be a studio that's just able to print money. Minions sell like hotcakes. And so, without the Renaissance, I doubt there is a Pixar's golden era, where they won Oscar after Oscar and printed money. There's no Shrek. There's no Kung Fu Panda. Hell, there probably isn't a Disney revival. Because there would have been no proof that these films were financially viable investments. And so, less studios, less investors, less people willing to take that chance. And so the animation industry on a whole would probably be in a much different place right now. And they would take a lot longer to find their feet. Because all in all, without the Disney Renaissance, everything would be different. And likely not for the better. So in terms of overall legacy, the Renaissance for me takes the cake. But what about the overall quality? And I'm talking about the critical reception here. Both of these eras are known to be popular and beloved. For the revival, the proof's in the pudding. They've won Oscars and acclaim after over a decade of being considered the inferior studio and mocked as lesser than Pixar. But the 2010s really turned that around for them. But the Renaissance, well, it started over 30 years ago, and those films, especially from the early 90s, they're still considered the gold standard. And if there had been a Best Animated Picture Oscar back in the day, I think The Little Mermaid would have won. Beauty and the Beast would have won. Lion King would have won. Pocahontas would probably lose to Toy Story. Hunchback would have been in the mix. I think Hercules had a chance if it could overcome Anastasia. Mulan takes it as well. Whilst Tarzan might win since nobody actually saw The Iron Giant. But The Iron Giant is still the better film by far. So, if you're looking back, that's pretty impressive. But context matters too. There was much less competition back then. And there were almost no major competitive studios yet. DreamWorks Animation's first film was in 1998. Pixar was in 1995. And so in a lot of ways, 90s Disney looks a lot better because there's no real point of comparison until halfway through the era. And then by the 2000s, they were completely eclipsed. But anyway, let's go to the scores next. Little Mermaid, 93% on Rotten Tomatoes with an average score of 8.1. Rescuers Down Under, 71%, average of 6.2. Beauty and the Beast, 94 and 8.5. Aladdin, 95 and 8.2. Lion King, 93 and 8.5. Pocahontas, 55 and 6. Hunchback, 71 and 7.1. Hercules, 84 and 7. Mulan, 86 and 7.6. Tarzan, 89 and 7.6. For the most part, quite consistently high approval ratings and scores. The only dark spot, I'd say, is Rescuers Down Under and Pocahontas, at least from critical perspectives. The Rescuers is completely forgotten, and Pocahontas, well, it wasn't well received, let's put it like that, shall we? So all in all, the Renaissance is tracking pretty well, but there's more than just critical acclaim to take into account. Ultimately, it's a business and thus money matters quite a lot, so let's take a look at that too. The Little Mermaid became the most successful animated film of all time when it released in terms of box office gross. The Rescuers, that wasn't it. Beauty and the Beast though, it topped the charts once again, as did Aladdin, as did The Lion King, and then Pocahontas. It didn't do nearly as well as Lion King, but it was still respectable. Same with Hunchback. Hercules did slip a bit more, Mulan was a bit better than that, and Tarzan much better than that. And so yeah, I think this is quite a successful commercial run. For the major studios, I would argue that the majority of these box office grosses do lean on the low side for this day and age, where 500 to 600 million regularly seems to be the goal. But you gotta look at this for the time of its release. In the 80s, this was unheard of. In the 90s, it was unheard of. These movies kept breaking Disney's own records, and Disney held all the records. And thus they pushed animation forward as a viable medium for investors to support and make good money out of. So in my eyes, it was a pretty tremendous success. Even if the numbers get higher the further you go along in terms of decade, the money that these 80s and 90s films earned is almost worth more, in that it had a much greater effect. And like I said, it really kick-started the animation industry. But let's not cast judgment too quickly, because now it's time to give the revival era its time in the sun. Like I said earlier, the revival era. It certainly has been a very good run for Disney. Starting in 2008, it really saw a return to form, and saw them cement themselves as Pixar's equal for the first time since Pixar blew up with Finding Nemo. and thus began their golden era run where they won Oscars and were kings of the box office. For the first time, Disney was winning the Oscars. They were getting awards for Frozen, Big Hero 6, and Zootopia within that time frame. Bolt, an 89% rating and a 7.2 score. Princess and the Frog, 85 and 7.4. Tangled, 89 and 7.5. Winnie the Pooh, 90 and 7.2. Wreck-It Ralph, 87 and 7.4. Frozen, 90 and 7.7. Big Hero 6, 90 and 7.4. Zootopia, 98 and 8.1. Moana, 95 and 7.9. Ralph Breaks the Internet, 88 and 7.3. And so, whilst the approval ratings sort of compete for the most part, although I think the Renaissance is a bit higher on average, the actual aggregate scores for the revival are actually a bit lower for the most part. The majority of Disney's 2010 run is more akin to post-95 Renaissance. The only film that really hits those early 90s highs in terms of its score is Zootopia. And so whilst I think that these films might be crunching out billion-dollar box offices sometimes, in the end, I think it's become quite clear to me that overall, when comparing every stat except for revenue, and even then, as I said earlier, there's a big asterisk next to that, I think that the Disney Renaissance era comes out on top as Disney's overall best era of filmmaking. I think the only thing in the animation industry that can compare to that legacy is probably Pixar's golden era, right? But that's a story for another day. And so, yeah, with all that being said, that's the end of the video, and I would like to say that these have just been my opinions, and now I'd like to hear yours. What did you think of this topic? You team Renaissance or team Revival? I'm curious for your thoughts, so make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and let me know.